Hello, friends.
Ryan and Sienna first crossed paths at a lively house party that felt like a magical crossroads of their lives. Ryan was there reluctantly, dragged by a friend, while Sienna was the life of the event, radiant in a simple red dress that drew every gaze in the room. She was confident, witty, and had a spark that Ryan found impossible to ignore. They collided by chance at the makeshift bar in the kitchen when Sienna reached for the same bottle of wine Ryan had been eyeing. "Great taste," she said with a smirk. He chuckled nervously, feeling the warmth of her charm. They talked for hours that night, lost in each other's stories. She had a dream of starting her own business, a boutique design firm. He shared his passion for woodworking, a hobby he hoped to turn into a career. They were both dreamers, and that connection ignited a chemistry that was immediate and electric. The next day, Ryan mustered the courage to call her. They went out for coffee, then dinner, and before long, they were inseparable. Their whirlwind romance became the stuff of envy among friends. A year later, Ryan proposed to Sienna in the workshop he had lovingly transformed into a romantic haven, adorned with candles and the scent of freshly cut cedar. She said yes, tears streaming down her face as she held him close. They married in an intimate ceremony, where their shared dreams were whispered in vows beneath a canopy of blooming wisteria. The first year of marriage was bliss. They moved into a modest house in a quiet suburb and set about building a life together. Ryan worked on custom furniture commissions, and Sienna began laying the groundwork for her design firm. They spent late nights dreaming about the future, sketching plans for their careers and the family they wanted to start. Life felt full of promise, with days painted in golden hues of love and ambition. But beneath the idyllic surface, cracks were beginning to form. Subtle at first, they were easy to ignore. Ryan noticed that Sienna spent more time on her phone, often typing away with a furrowed brow. She'd brush off his questions with a vague, "just work stuff." Meanwhile, his own struggles with meeting client demands left him feeling inadequate. The first real argument came one night over dinner. Sienna had landed her first big client and wanted to celebrate, but Ryan, exhausted from a grueling day, was distant. "Can't you at least pretend to be happy for me?" she snapped. "I am happy for you," he replied, his tone sharp. He stopped himself, unsure how to articulate the jealousy and frustration bubbling beneath his surface. That night, Ryan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when things had begun to shift. The love was still there, but the cracks were deepening. They patched things up, of course. The next morning, Sienna kissed him on the cheek and said, "I know you're proud of me. I just need to hear it sometimes." He apologized, vowing to be more supportive. But the incident left a lingering unease. Months later, their relationship faced another test. Ryan discovered a string of late-night text messages on Sienna's phone. She had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone lighting up with notifications. Curiosity got the better of him, and he glanced at the screen. The messages were from someone named Ethan, a name he didn't recognize. "Can't wait to see you again," one read. Another said, "Tonight was amazing." Ryan's heart raced as he scrolled through the conversation. It was clear that Ethan wasn't just a colleague. When Sienna woke up, she found Ryan sitting in the dark, holding her phone. "Who's Ethan?" he asked, his voice trembling. She froze, her face draining of color. "He's a client," she stammered. Ryan's trust was shaken, but Sienna swore nothing inappropriate had happened. She insisted that Ethan was simply an overzealous client who misread her friendliness. Reluctantly, Ryan chose to believe her, though doubts lingered. The tension began to affect Ryan's work. Orders were delayed, and clients grew impatient. His once thriving workshop now felt like a prison of sawdust and failure. Meanwhile, Sienna's business flourished. She spent more nights out networking and less time at home. Their shared dreams began to feel like distant echoes. One day, Ryan stumbled upon a folder on Sienna's laptop while searching for photos to print. It contained dozens of images of her with Ethan, at dinners, events, even what looked like a weekend getaway. The timestamp on the photos confirmed they had been taken recently. Confronting her that evening, Ryan could barely contain his anger. "You lied to me," he said, holding up her laptop. Sienna didn't deny it. She confessed to having an emotional affair, insisting it never crossed a physical line. I was lonely, Ryan. You've been so wrapped up in your work, and I needed someone to talk to. Her words hit him like a hammer. I'm here every day, Sienna, he said, his voice breaking. Why wasn't I enough? They decided to try counseling, clinging to the hope that their marriage could be salvaged. But the sessions only revealed deeper issues: Ryan's feelings of inadequacy, Sienna's fear of failure, and their mutual inability to communicate. Though they managed to rebuild some semblance of trust, the scars remained. Despite everything, Ryan still loved her. He wanted to believe they could weather the storm, that the dreams they once shared could still be realized. But as they sat together one evening, staring at the plans they had once drawn for their future, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The cracks were now chasms, and he wasn't sure they could ever be bridged. The tension in our marriage didn't start with shouting matches or slammed doors. It crept in like a quiet storm, unnoticed at first but growing stronger with every passing day. 1.5 years into our marriage, the honeymoon phase was a distant memory. Sienna's irritability seemed to emerge from nowhere, like storm clouds forming on an otherwise sunny horizon. At first, I thought it was just stress from her growing business. It's normal, I told myself. She's juggling a lot. Be patient. But patience wasn't enough. She started accusing me of being indifferent, of not supporting her dreams the way she needed me to. I'd try to listen, try to understand, but no matter what I said or did, it always seemed to fall short. She'd snap at me for things as small as forgetting to fold the laundry or not asking about her latest client meeting. And when I tried to defend myself, to remind her that I was doing my best, her irritation turned into full-blown accusations. You're jealous of my success, she said one night, her eyes flashing with anger. Admit it, Ryan. You hate that I'm doing better than you. I was stunned. Jealous? Sienna, I'm proud of you. Everything I do is for us, to support you. Support me, she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. By hiding in that workshop of yours all day? You don't even try to connect with me anymore. Her words cut deep because, in some ways, they weren't entirely wrong. I had thrown myself into my woodworking business, not just as a way to contribute financially but as an escape. The cracks in our marriage felt less suffocating when I was sanding down a piece of oak or fitting dovetail joints together. At least in the workshop, things made sense. But I wasn't indifferent. I wasn't jealous. I loved her. I just didn't know how to fix whatever was breaking between us. The arguments became more frequent, always circling back to the same themes. Sienna felt I wasn't doing enough, and I felt she didn't see how hard I was trying. I started to dread coming home in the evenings, knowing I'd walk into a storm of tension. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to talk about how much it was affecting me. I thought if I just kept my head down and worked harder, it would get better. One night, after another exhausting argument, I found myself sitting in the darkened kitchen long after Sienna had gone to bed. I stared at the plans we'd drawn together in those early days, the blueprint for the dream home we'd once talked about building. I traced the lines with my finger, remembering how excited we'd been. It felt like a lifetime ago. The following morning, Sienna was colder than usual. She barely looked at me as we ate breakfast, her attention fixed on her phone. The light in her eyes that had once drawn me in seemed dimmed, replaced by something sharper, more distant. Do you want to talk about last night? I asked hesitantly. What's there to talk about? She replied, not looking up. I sighed, setting my coffee mug down. Sienna, we can't keep doing this. Doing what? She said, finally meeting my gaze. You're the one who shuts me out, Ryan. I've been trying to talk to you for months, but you just retreat into your workshop like it's some kind of fortress. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but a part of me knew she wasn't. Still, her tone made my defenses rise. And what about you? I countered. You're always on your phone or out at some networking event. When was the last time you actually spent an evening here with me? She scoffed. Because sitting in silence while you sulk in the corner sounds so appealing. The words stung, but I held my ground. I'm not sulking, Sienna. I'm trying to keep things together. Are you? She snapped. Because it doesn't feel that way to me. That argument ended like so many others, unresolved. Sienna left for work, slamming the door behind her, and I stayed home, feeling like a failure. I went to the workshop, hoping to lose myself in the rhythm of sanding and sawing, but my hands trembled too much to work. Things hit a new low when Sienna started spending more nights out. She claimed it was for business, and maybe it was, but it felt like she was avoiding me. One Friday evening, she came home hours after she said she would, reeking of wine and perfume. "Late night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She shrugged, kicking off her heels. The client dinner ran long. Her tone was casual, but something about the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. I wanted to ask more, to press her on where she'd been, but I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The truth was, I didn't want to know if there was something she wasn't telling me. I wasn't sure I could handle it. The turning point came during a family barbecue. Sienna and I had barely spoken all week, and I hoped the gathering might ease some of the tension. But the day was a disaster. She spent most of it chatting with her colleagues, barely acknowledging me. When I tried to join the conversation, she brushed me off with a terse, "This is work stuff, Ryan. You wouldn't get it." By the time we got home, I was seething. "Do you even care about this marriage anymore?" I blurted out as she walked through the door. She froze, turning to look at me with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Don't you dare put this all on me," she said. "I've been trying, Ryan." "But you," she broke off, shaking her head. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we're just not meant to work." Her words felt like a knife to the chest. I stood there, unable to respond, as she walked past me and into the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. That night, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd gotten here. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd promised to spend my life with, felt like a stranger. And I had no idea how to find my way back to her. It started innocently enough, or at least, that's what I told myself. Sienna had been talking about wanting a break for weeks. "I just need to clear my head," she said one evening, scrolling through Instagram, her feed filled with pictures of exotic places and smiling faces. "Maybe a trip would do me some good," she added, not looking up. I hesitated. "A trip? Where would you go?" She shrugged. "Europe. I've been thinking about it for a while. A girls' trip with some of the women from my networking group. They've been planning it for months." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The timing felt off. We were barely speaking most days, and now she wanted to leave for 2 weeks? Still, I didn't want to be the controlling husband, the kind of man who held her back. So, I nodded. "If that's what you need." Her face lit up, a rare smile breaking through the tension that had defined us for months. "Thank you, Ryan. I really need this." And just like that, the trip was booked. In the days leading up to her departure, I tried to suppress the unease growing inside me. I told myself it was just my insecurities talking, that this trip was exactly what Sienna needed to reset and come back to me. But when the day arrived and I drove her to the airport, the goodbye felt heavier than it should have. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice almost mechanical as she kissed me on the cheek. "You too," I replied, watching as she walked through security without looking back. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. I tried to distract myself with work, burying my frustrations in a new furniture project. But every time my phone buzzed, I'd reach for it, hoping it was her. It rarely was. Her messages were brief, vague updates about the trip. Having a great time, or just saw the Eiffel Tower. There were no details, no photos, just enough to let me know she was still alive. When I called, it often went to voicemail, and the few times she did pick up, the conversations were hurried, as though she had somewhere more important to be. "Sorry, Ryan," she said during one call. "The girls are waiting for me. Can we talk later?" "Sure," I replied, trying to hide my disappointment. But later never came. By the end of the first week, my unease had turned into full-blown suspicion. It wasn't just the lack of communication, it was the way she seemed to be avoiding me. The woman who used to send me pictures of her lunch now couldn't be bothered to share anything about a trip she'd supposedly been dreaming about for months. I started scrolling through her social media, looking for clues. Her Instagram was unusually quiet. No posts, no stories, just radio silence. It didn't add up. The Sienna I knew would have been flooding her feed with pictures of cobblestone streets and cappuccinos by now. That's when I noticed something strange. One of her friends, a woman named Danielle who was supposedly on the trip with her, had posted a photo of herself at a vineyard in Italy. Sienna wasn't in it. Curious, I clicked through Danielle's profile, scanning her recent posts. There were plenty of group photos, but Sienna was nowhere to be seen. My chest tightened. Was she even with them? That night, I called her again. This time, she didn't pick up. I left a voicemail, trying to keep my tone neutral. Hey, Sienna. Just wanted to check in. Hope everything's going well. Call me when you can. She didn't call back. By the time the second week rolled around, I couldn't focus on anything else. I spent hours replaying our conversations, analyzing every word for hidden meanings. Was she really with her friends? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? The final straw came when I received a text from Ethan. Yes, Ethan. The same Ethan whose name had haunted me since I found those photos months ago. Payment. Hope all's good. Just checking in to see how Sienna's doing on her trip. Haven't heard from her in a while. I stared at the message, my hands trembling. Why was Ethan asking me about Sienna? And why would he expect to hear from her on a girl's trip? I didn't respond. Instead, I sat there, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I thought about the late-night arguments, the coldness in her eyes, the nights she spent out without explanation. And now this, a trip that didn't make sense, a man who shouldn't be asking questions. I decided to confront her directly. That evening, I called her again, but this time I didn't leave a voicemail. Instead, I sent a text, "We need to talk. Call me." Hours passed with no response. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she with Ethan? Was there someone else? The next day, I tried calling Danielle. We'd only met a couple of times, but I hoped she might fill in some of the blanks. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I left a message. Hi, Danielle. This is Ryan, Sienna's husband. Just wanted to check in and see how the trip's going. Give me a call when you get a chance. She never called back. When Sienna finally returned home, 2 weeks later, she looked different. Her tan was deeper, her hair lighter, but there was something else, an energy about her that felt foreign. She greeted me with a quick hug, then brushed past me to drop her bags in the hallway. How was the trip? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Good, she said, her tone clipped. Exhausting. I need a shower. And just like that, she disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing there with 1,000 unanswered questions. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The woman I loved was slipping further and further away, and I was no closer to understanding why. All I knew was that something had changed, and whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of the end. It was a week after Sienna returned from Europe that I stumbled upon the first photo. I wasn't actively looking for anything. At least, that's what I told myself, but curiosity had been gnawing at me ever since she walked through the door with that unfamiliar glow. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling no matter how much I tried to bury it under the weight of my own doubts. Her laptop was sitting open on the kitchen counter. She'd left it there while she took a shower, and the screen had gone to sleep. I don't know what compelled me to reach for it, but before I could second-guess myself, I was navigating to her photos folder. It wasn't password protected, which surprised me. Sienna usually kept everything locked down tight. At first, the pictures seemed innocent enough. Shots of picturesque streets, historic landmarks, and glasses of wine against European backdrops. But then I noticed a folder tucked into the corner of her desktop, labeled Trip Extras. My heart raced as I clicked on it. The first few photos were typical, more sightseeing, group dinners, and selfies. But as I scrolled, the images became different. There was one of Sienna at a club, a drink in her hand, her body pressed a little too closely to a man I didn't recognize. He had his arms slung casually over her shoulder, his head tilted toward hers like they were sharing a private joke. My stomach churned. Who was he? Why hadn't she mentioned him? The next photo was even worse. It showed Sienna laughing, her head thrown back, while the same man kissed her cheek. She wasn't pulling away. If anything, she looked like she was enjoying it. I kept scrolling, my hands trembling. There were videos too, Short clips of Sienna dancing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. In one, the man from the photos was holding her waist as they swayed together, her laughter ringing out over the thumping music. It was the kind of carefree, unguarded joy I hadn't seen in her for months, maybe years. I closed the folder and stepped back from the counter, my mind spinning. What was I supposed to do with this? Should I confront her? Demand answers? Or would she just brush it off, the way she had with everything else lately? That evening, as we sat together on the couch, I couldn't help but watch her. She seemed calm, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I wanted to ask her about the photos, but I didn't know how to start. Instead, I said, "How's Danielle?" She seemed like she was having a good time on the trip. Sienna didn't even look up. "She's good. Why? I just realized I haven't seen her around lately. Didn't she get back the same time as you?" That got her attention. She glanced at me, her expression shifting slightly. "No, she left a couple of days early. Something came up with her family." The knot in my stomach tightened. Danielle's social media told a different story. She'd posted a photo from her backyard the same day Sienna had claimed they were visiting a vineyard together. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice as casual as I could. "I didn't realize." Sienna shrugged and went back to her phone. But now I was certain she was hiding something. The next day, while she was at work, I decided to dig deeper. I scrolled through her Instagram again, searching for clues. Most of her posts from the trip were generic, scenic views, artsy shots of food, but there was one video that caught my eye. It was a short clip of her sitting at an outdoor cafe, smiling at the camera as she raised her glass. In the background, just barely visible, was the reflection of a man in the cafe window. He was leaning toward her, his face partially obscured, but it was clear he wasn't just a random passerby. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Was it the same guy from the photos? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't bring myself to confront her outright, not without more proof. Instead, I decided to reach out to Danielle. She'd ignored my call before, but maybe she'd be more willing to talk over text. "Hey Danielle," I wrote. "This is Ryan. Just wanted to check in about the trip. Sienna's been pretty quiet about it, and I thought you might have some fun stories to share." Her reply came an hour later. "Hi, Ryan. It was a great trip. Lots of sightseeing, late nights, you know how it is." Sienna seemed to have a good time. I stared at the message, my frustration mounting. It was vague, evasive, exactly what I didn't need. I decided to push a little harder. "Sounds amazing. Sienna mentioned you had to leave early. Everything okay?" This time, her response was immediate. "Yeah, just some family stuff. Nothing major. Hope you're doing well." I could practically hear the door slamming shut. Danielle wasn't going to tell me anything. That night, I finally broke. As Sienna and I sat down to dinner, I looked at her across the table and said, "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do I have to keep playing detective?" She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What are you talking about?" "The photos. The videos. That guy you were with in Europe?" Her eyes widened, but only for a moment. Then she set her fork down and crossed her arms. "You went through my stuff?" "Don't turn this around on me," I said, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me, Sienna. I saw the pictures. I saw you with him." She stared at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but then she said, "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, because from where I'm standing it looks pretty damn clear. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "We were just having fun. He's a friend of Danielle's. It wasn't serious." "Not serious?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You were letting him kiss you, for God's sake. How is that not serious?" She didn't answer, and the silence was deafening. I pushed my chair back and stood, unable to look at her anymore. "I need some air," I muttered, grabbing my keys and heading for the door. As I drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. How had we gotten here? Was this the end of our marriage? And most of all, could I ever trust her again? Sienna announced her pregnancy 3 weeks after the confrontation about Europe. The timing couldn't have been worse. We were still walking on eggshells around each other, trying to find some way to bridge the growing chasm between us. But her words landed like a bomb, ripping apart whatever fragile stability we had left. "I'm pregnant," she said one evening, standing in the doorway of my workshop. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. I froze, the piece of wood I'd been sanding forgotten in my hands. "Pregnant," she repeated, a little more firmly this time. Her gaze flickered to the floor, then back up to meet mine. "I just found out." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was something we'd talked about once, in the early days of our marriage, when life still felt full of promise. We dreamed of kids and a house filled with laughter. But now it felt like an anchor tied to my chest, pulling me under. "How far along are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About 6 weeks," she said, stepping further into the room. "Ryan, I know this isn't exactly the best timing, but maybe this is what we need. A fresh start." I couldn't hide the doubt on my face. 6 weeks. That put the conception squarely during her trip to Europe. My mind immediately flashed back to the photos and videos I'd found, the man who had been far too close to her for comfort. I cleared my throat, setting the wood and sandpaper aside. "Are you sure about that timeline?" Her expression hardened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means, Sienna," I said, my voice cold. "I need to know if this child is mine." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she took a deep breath, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I can't believe you'd even suggest that," she hissed. "Of course it's yours, Ryan. Who else would it be?" I stared at her, my stomach churning. "Do you really want me to answer that?" Her face crumpled, and she turned on her heel, storming out of the workshop. I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed where I was, leaning heavily against the workbench, trying to process what had just happened. The days that followed were tense, to say the least. Sienna barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was clipped and defensive. But I couldn't shake the suspicion gnawing at my gut. I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself unless I got the truth. When I finally brought up the idea of a DNA test, she exploded. "You're unbelievable," she snapped, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "I tell you I'm pregnant, and your first reaction is to accuse me of cheating?" "I'm not accusing you," I said, though my tone betrayed me. "I just want to be sure." "Sure about what?" she demanded, rounding on me. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you? You think I slept with someone else?" "I think I have a right to know," I said, meeting her glare with one of my own. "Given everything that's happened, don't you think that's fair?" Her face twisted with anger, but she didn't argue. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I didn't hear from her for hours, and when she finally came back, she wouldn't look at me. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "You want a DNA test? We'll do a DNA test." The weeks leading up to the test results were some of the longest of my life. Sienna and I barely spoke, existing in a tense, uncomfortable silence. She threw herself into work, and I buried myself in the workshop, trying to distract myself from the nagging doubts that wouldn't leave me alone. When the envelope finally arrived, I couldn't open it right away. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for what felt like hours, the weight of it pressing down on me. Sienna sat across from me, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said finally, her voice sharp. "Are you going to open it, or should I?" I took a deep breath and tore the envelope open, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. My eyes scanned the words and my heart sank. Probability of paternity, 0%. The paper fell from my hands, fluttering to the table. Sienna reached for it, her movements slow and deliberate. When she saw the results, her face went pale. "It's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has to be a mistake." "It's not a mistake," I said, my voice hollow. "You lied to me." "I didn't," she stopped, her hands trembling as she gripped the paper. "Ryan, I didn't mean for this to happen." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Didn't mean for what to happen, Sienna? To sleep with someone else? To get pregnant with their child and try to pass it off as mine?" Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. I was lonely, she said, her voice breaking. You were so distant and I made a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my anger boiling over. You call this a mistake? You destroyed everything, Sienna. Everything we built together. And for what? A fling? She didn't answer, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Instead, I stood, pushing my chair back with enough force to make it scrape loudly against the floor. I need some time to think, I said, my voice cold. Don't wait up. I grabbed my jacket and left the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. As I walked aimlessly through the empty streets, one thought kept echoing in my mind. This was the end. There was no coming back from this. Filing for divorce was not a decision I made lightly. For weeks after the DNA results came back, I wrestled with the anger, betrayal, and heartbreak that had consumed me. Part of me wanted to hold on, to believe there was some way to salvage what we once had, but the damage was too great. Sienna's actions had shattered everything: trust, love, respect. There was nothing left to save. The final straw came when I heard through mutual friends that Sienna was spreading rumors about me. According to them, she was telling anyone who would listen that I had been emotionally abusive, neglectful, and controlling. It was the kind of lie designed to shift the blame entirely onto me, to paint herself as the victim in a story where she was anything but. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even try to deny it. I'm not going to let you ruin my life, she said, her tone icy. If people ask why we're getting divorced, I'm going to tell them the truth. Your truth, I shot back. Not the truth. What difference does it make? She replied with a shrug. People will believe what they want to believe. Her indifference was like a punch to the gut. That night, I sat in the empty living room, staring at the stack of papers my lawyer had given me. The decision was no longer difficult. It was necessary. The next morning, I filed for divorce. The process was as messy as I'd expected. Sienna fought me at every turn, dragging out negotiations over property, finances, and every other aspect of our lives that needed untangling. But the worst part wasn't the legal battles. It was the lies. She doubled down on the rumors, painting me as a cruel and controlling husband who had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. It wasn't long before the whispers started affecting my life. Clients who had once been enthusiastic about my work began canceling orders. Friends I thought I could count on stopped returning my calls. Even people I barely knew seemed to look at me differently, their smiles tinged with pity or suspicion. One evening, after yet another canceled meeting, I sat down with my lawyer and laid everything out. She's ruining my reputation, I said, my frustration boiling over. This isn't just about the divorce anymore. She's making sure I lose everything. My lawyer nodded, her expression serious. If what you're saying is true, you might have grounds for a defamation case. But you'll need evidence. Gathering that evidence became my sole focus. I combed through every message, every email, and every social media post, looking for anything that could prove Sienna's lies. I reached out to mutual friends, asking them to share what they'd heard and, if possible, provide written statements. It was exhausting and often disheartening, but I refused to let her destroy me without a fight. The turning point came when one of her former friends, Danielle, of all people, came forward with a series of texts. In them, Sienna admitted to fabricating stories about me to protect her image. He's going to look like the bad guy no matter what, one message read. People always believe the woman. I just need to make sure I get ahead of the narrative. When my lawyer saw the messages, she smiled for the first time in weeks. This is gold, she said. With this, we can prove she acted with malicious intent. The defamation case was grueling, but for the first time since the nightmare began, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. Sienna tried to spin her usual narrative in court, playing the victim and accusing me of every misdeed she could imagine. But the evidence was damning. The texts, combined with testimony from people who had heard her lies firsthand, left little room for doubt. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Sienna was ordered to pay damages and issue a public retraction of her statements. It wasn't about the money, it was about clearing my name. Seeing her forced to admit that she had lied was a bittersweet victory, one that came at great personal cost but felt necessary to move forward. The divorce was finalized shortly after, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of relief. The house was sold, the proceeds split, and I moved into a small apartment closer to my workshop. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a space where I could start over. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. My business slowly recovered as word spread that the rumors weren't true. Friends who had distanced themselves began reaching out, apologizing for believing Sienna's lies. Some relationships were mended, while others were left behind, casualties of a storm I couldn't entirely control. As for Sienna, I heard she moved to another city not long after the case ended. From what little I know, she's raising the child on her own. Part of me feels sorry for her, but only a small part. She made her choices, and she'll have to live with the consequences. Looking back, I don't regret filing for divorce or pursuing the defamation case. It was painful, messy, and far from the life I had imagined for myself, but it was also freeing. I'm not the same person I was when Sienna and I stood under that canopy of wisteria, promising to build a life together. But I've learned to be okay with that. I've learned that sometimes the only way forward is to let go of the past, even if it means burning bridges you once thought were unbreakable.
Bye-bye.